Hey guys, tonight we're diving into what historians universally agree was the absolute worst year to be alive in all of recorded human history. You're about to experience 536 AD through the eyes of an ordinary peasant, and spoiler alert, you probably won't make it to 537. Picture this: you wake up one morning and the sun looks wrong. Not gone, just broken. Like someone draped a dirty sheet across the heavens and forgot to take it down. The light is there technically, but it's pale, weak, and utterly useless for growing anything that might keep you alive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I love knowing there are fellow insomniacs scattered across the globe, all choosing to learn about medieval misery instead of sleeping like normal people. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a peasant farmer somewhere in what will one day be called Europe, though right now it's just the place where nothing grows anymore. Your world consists of a mud-walled hut, a few scraggly chickens, and maybe 3 acres of land that used to produce enough barley to keep your family fed. Used to being the key phrase here, because this morning the sky has decided to cosplay as the inside of a tomb. What you don't know, because you're living in an age where the evening news consists of whatever rumors the village drunk brings back from the next town over, is that somewhere far away, possibly in Iceland or maybe Central America, a massive volcanic eruption has hurled millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Historians still argue whether it was one catastrophic blast or a series of eruptions, but the result is the same: a global atmospheric shroud that's about to turn your world into a frozen hellscape for the next several years. The ash doesn't fall like snow. That would be too obvious, too dramatic. Instead, it hangs in the upper atmosphere like the world's most persistent fog, reflecting sunlight back into space and leaving you with what looks like perpetual twilight. The temperature has already dropped several degrees, though you measure cold in terms of my breath fogs indoors rather than Fahrenheit. You step outside to check your crops, because that's what farmers do, even when hope has packed its bags and moved to a warmer climate, and notice the barley shoots look confused. They're not growing exactly, but they're not dying either. They're just sitting there waiting for proper sunlight that's never coming. Your chickens have stopped laying eggs, with any regularity huddling together in their coop like they're planning something ominous. The strangest part is how normal everything else seems. Birds still chirp, though less enthusiastically. Your neighbor still waves when he sees you, though his wave has developed a distinctly nervous quality. The church bell still rings at appropriate times, calling people to pray for sunshine that God seems to have misplaced somewhere behind the cosmic equivalent of a really thick curtain. You tell yourself this is just a weird weather pattern, maybe a particularly stubborn winter. Your grandfather once told stories about a year when spring came late, so surely this is similar. Surely the sun will remember how to shine properly by next week, next month at the latest. You're still operating under the quaint assumption that the natural world follows predictable patterns, and that humans are more than just cosmic accident victims waiting for their turn to become historical footnotes. But deep down in that part of your brain, that evolved specifically to recognize when things are about to go catastrophically wrong. You know, this isn't normal. This is the beginning of something much worse. You just don't know how much worse yet. The first sign that your crops are truly doomed comes not with dramatic wilting or sudden death, but with a kind of agricultural depression that's almost worse. Your barley just stops trying. The shoots that managed to push through the cold soil in early spring, back when you still believed spring was a real season that would arrive on schedule, now sit frozen in place, like green question marks stabbed into the earth. You walk your fields every morning with the dedication of a monk, checking prayer beads, hoping to spot some miracle of growth. What you find instead is silence, not the peaceful quiet of healthy soil, but the ominous hush of a world that's forgotten how to be alive. The seedlings you planted with such optimism 2 months ago have turned into tiny monuments to misplaced faith. They're not rotting exactly, which would at least indicate some kind of biological activity. They're just paused as if waiting for permission to continue existing. The problem, though, you lack the meteorological vocabulary to understand it, is that your crops need more than just light. They need the right kind of light, delivered at the right time, with the right intensity. The volcanic aerosols swirling in the stratosphere have created what scientists would one day call a nuclear winter effect, though without the benefit of nuclear weapons. Your plants are essentially trying to photosynthesize through a dirty window while wearing sunglasses. You try everything your father taught you and everything his father taught him. You water more frequently, though the well water has taken on a metallic taste that makes you wonder if even the Earth's underground reserves are somehow contaminated. You carefully weed around each pathetic sprout, as if removing competition might somehow inspire them to greatness. You even try talking to them, which your wife pretends not to notice, because she's developing her own concerning habits, like hoarding the last few handfuls of grain and counting them obsessively. The beans fare no better. What should be climbing enthusiastically up their support sticks instead droop like defeated flags. The peas, normally hardy enough to survive reasonable cold snaps, turn yellow and mushy at their roots. Even the turnips, the agricultural equivalent of cockroaches in terms of survival instincts, refuse to bulk up underground. You dig up a few to check, and they're no bigger than your thumb with the texture of wet wood. But nature, as it turns out, still has a sense of humor, just a really dark one. While your food crops are staging their collective suicide, other things thrive with almost insulting enthusiasm. Mold spreads across everything, like it's been personally invited to the party. Fungi bloom on the undersides of leaves in the corners of your grain stores, on the wooden tools you've left outside for more than a day. It's as if the world has decided to become one giant, slow-motion compost pile. Historians still argue whether the climate disruption of 536 was caused by a single, massive volcanic event or multiple eruptions occurring in sequence, but they all agree on one thing. It was the beginning of what scholars call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that would last for over a century. You, however, are more concerned with the immediate problem of having accidentally eaten your seed grain last Tuesday because your stomach was making sounds that could be heard from the next village. The cruel irony is that you know exactly what you're supposed to do. Save some grain for next year's planting, ration carefully, plan for a difficult but survivable winter. The problem is that these strategies were designed for normal difficulties, not for whatever cosmic practical joke you're currently living through. Your great grandfather's wisdom about surviving hard times was based on the assumption that hard times eventually end, that spring follows winter with the reliability of sunrise. But sunrise itself has become unreliable. The sun appears, technically speaking, but it's a pale, apologetic version of its former self, offering about as much warmth as a candle held at arm's length. Your internal calendar evolved over thousands of years to respond to seasonal light cues is thoroughly confused. Your body thinks it's still early winter. The plants think it's still early winter. Even the insects seem bewildered, emerging at random times, and then immediately regretting their decision. You start making increasingly desperate agricultural decisions. You replant sections that clearly aren't working, using up precious seed reserves. You try moving seedlings to different parts of your plot, searching for some microclimate that might be slightly less apocalyptic. You even experiment with building small shelters around individual plants, tiny wooden lean-tos that make your field look like a refugee camp for vegetables. Nothing works. By midsummer, though, calling it summer requires a generous interpretation of the term. You're forced to accept that this year's harvest will consist of whatever you can scrape together from the few plants that manage to produce anything before giving up entirely. And by anything, you mean turnips the size of marbles and grain stalks so sparse they look like they're rationing their own seeds. The transition from hungry to starving happens so gradually that you don't notice when you cross the line. One day, you're cutting meals in half to make them last longer, and the next, you're staring at your last handful of barley while trying to calculate whether your family can survive on one meal every other day. The math, unfortunately, doesn't work out in your favor. You start with the obvious substitutions. Tree bark stripped carefully from birches and boiled until it resembles something that could charitably be called porridge. Your wife develops an impressive ability to make leather taste like food by soaking it in salt water and cooking it for hours until it's soft enough to chew without breaking teeth. The children bless their adaptable little souls, stop complaining about meals that would have horrified them 6 months ago. Hunger, it turns out, is an excellent seasoning, but bark and leather are stopgap measures, not solutions. They fill the empty space in your stomach without actually providing much in the way of nutrition. You're essentially eating time, buying yourself a few more days to figure out something better. The problem is that something better seems to be in short supply throughout the known world. The seed grain that's sacred reserve, meant for next year's planting, becomes the elephant in your one-room hut. You all know it's there, hidden in a clay jar beneath the floorboards, but nobody mentions it directly. It's your family's future, assuming you live long enough to have one. But it's also your family's immediate survival, assuming you want to live long enough to worry about the future. This is the kind of philosophical dilemma that sounds profound until your stomach starts eating itself. Your wife breaks first, not dramatically, not with tears or grand pronouncements, but with a quiet practicality that's somehow more heartbreaking. She simply reaches for the jar one morning and scoops out enough grain for a thin gruel meeting your eyes, with a look that says, "We both know this was always going to happen." You eat in silence, and nobody mentions that you've just consumed part of spring. The village transforms into a collection of increasingly creative survival strategies. Your neighbor attempts to make flour from acorns, a process that involves multiple rounds of boiling to remove the tannins and results in something that tastes like bitter chalk but doesn't immediately kill you. The blacksmith's family has discovered that if you burn old leather in just the right way, the smoke can be condensed into something resembling meat broth. It doesn't taste like meat exactly, but it tastes like the memory of meat, which is close enough. Historians still argue whether the widespread reports of cannibalism during this period were accurate or simply the result of traumatized chroniclers trying to make sense of incomprehensible suffering. What's certain is that people disappeared with increasing frequency, and those who remained developed a careful habit of not asking too many questions about where their neighbors had gone or what was cooking in that pot that smelled suspiciously like something you'd rather not identify. The social fabric unravels with the same gradual inexorability as your diet. Sharing food, once a basic courtesy, becomes a strategic decision. Hospitality transforms from a virtue into a luxury nobody can afford. You stop inviting people into your home because you literally cannot feed them, and they stop expecting invitations because they understand. The village well becomes a place for hurried water collection rather than social gathering, partly because everyone's too weak for prolonged conversation, and partly because nobody wants to admit how bad things have gotten. Your children adapt with the resilience that only the very young possess, finding games in situations that would break adult minds. They play feast with pebbles and mud, creating elaborate imaginary meals and discussing the flavor profiles of rocks. They invent stories about magical times when people ate until they were full, treating abundance like a fairy tale. It's charming until you realize they're not pretending. They genuinely cannot imagine a world where food is plentiful. The church becomes both refuge and source of additional anxiety. The priest continues to hold services, though his sermons have taken on an increasingly desperate quality. He speaks of trials sent by God to test faith, of Job's sufferings, of rewards waiting in the afterlife. But you notice his hands shake when he raises the communion bread, and that bread has become noticeably smaller each week. Even divine intervention apparently is subject to rationing. You develop what future psychologists might recognize as trauma responses, though you lack the vocabulary to describe them. You become obsessively protective of food scraps, hiding tiny portions in places you immediately forget. You wake up multiple times each night to check that your grain stores haven't vanished. You find yourself chewing slowly, desperately, trying to extract maximum satisfaction from each meager bite. Every meal becomes a meditation on scarcity. The worst part isn't the physical hunger, though that's certainly unpleasant enough. It's the way hunger changes how you think, how you relate to others, how you see the world. You catch yourself calculating the caloric value of your neighbors, wondering how long the old woman next door might last, whether the sick child down the path is wasting resources that could keep healthier people alive a few more days. These thoughts horrify you, but they come anyway, unbidden and persistent as the cold. Just when you think your situation couldn't possibly deteriorate further because surely the universe has exhausted its capacity for creative cruelty. Disease arrives, like an uninvited guest who brought all their friends to the party. The plague of Justinian, named after the Byzantine emperor who will have the misfortune of ruling during this catastrophe, begins its methodical tour of your weakened world. It starts as rumors from the East, stories that sound too terrible to be true. Constantinople, they say, is burying 10,000 people a day. Ships arrive in ports with their entire crews dead. Markets close because there's nobody left to buy or sell anything. You listen to these tales with the detached interest of someone hearing about problems that surely couldn't happen here in your small village, where the most exciting event in recent memory was a pig giving birth to 7 piglets instead of the usual 6. But disease, unlike crops, doesn't require favorable weather conditions to thrive. In fact, it seems to appreciate the current circumstances immensely. Your village, with its overcrowded huts and complete absence of sanitation, offers ideal conditions for an epidemic. People huddle together for warmth-sharing air bedding and whatever pathogens have recently joined the community. The weak immune systems that come with months of malnutrition provide practically no resistance to new infections. The first victim is your neighbor's youngest child, who develops a fever that won't break and swellings in his neck that grow to the size of eggs. By the time you recognize what's happening, it's already spreading through the village, like gossip jumping from house to house with impressive efficiency. The bubonic plague, though you know it simply as the swelling death, has arrived to add its own particular flavor to your already miserable existence. Historians still argue whether the plague that devastated the Byzantine Empire was the same strain responsible for the later Black Death, but they agree on its devastating impact. It killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. From your perspective, however, these statistics are meaningless. What matters is that people you've known your entire life are dying in ways that seem designed by a particularly vindictive deity. The symptoms are grotesque enough to inspire nightmares if you were still getting enough sleep to dream properly. The characteristic buboes, swollen lymph nodes that can grow as large as apples, appear in the groin, armpits, and neck. Victims develop high fevers, chills, and a distinctive smell that you learn to recognize from 3 houses away. Some people die within days, others linger for weeks, and a lucky few somehow recover, though they're often left permanently weakened. Your village lacks anything resembling medical knowledge beyond herbal remedies that work about as well as you'd expect. The local healer, a woman who claims to understand the balance of bodily humors, recommends bloodletting for people who are already weakened by starvation. The priest suggests prayer and fasting, which would be helpful advice if anyone still had enough food to fast meaningfully. A traveling merchant brings word of a cure involving crushed pearls and unicorn horn, though neither ingredient appears to be locally available. The social dynamics of plague are almost as deadly as the disease itself. Families abandon sick relatives not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate calculation that sacrificing one person might save the rest. Houses are sealed with the sick inside, essentially turning homes into tombs. You develop an intimate knowledge of which dwellings have gone quiet and which still show signs of life, though determining the difference sometimes requires careful observation of smoke patterns and the presence or absence of flies. Your own family manages to avoid the worst of it, either through luck, slightly better nutrition, or sheer bloody mindedness. But you watch the village population shrink with each passing week. The blacksmith dies, leaving no one who knows how to repair essential tools. The miller succumbs, though there's precious little grain left to mill anyway. The woman who used to lead children in songs dies quietly in her sleep, and suddenly there's no one left who remembers all the words to the old lullabies. The psychological impact proves almost as destructive as the physical toll. You become hypervigilant about symptoms, checking yourself and your family members obsessively for signs of fever or swelling. Every cough sends a spike of terror through your chest. You sleep poorly not just from hunger, but from the constant awareness that death is literally in the air you breathe. The village develops a collective paranoia, with people avoiding contact conversation and even eye contact. Burial becomes a logistical nightmare. There aren't enough healthy people left to dig proper graves, especially for those who die during the hardest part of winter when the ground is frozen solid. Bodies accumulate in common pits, often without ceremony or even identification. The priest does his best to maintain some semblance of Christian burial practices, but eventually even he admits defeat and settles for mass blessings over communal graves. The plague doesn't just kill people, it kills knowledge, traditions, and social structures. The old woman who knew how to predict weather patterns dies taking her wisdom with her. The man who understood crop rotation cycles succumbs, leaving behind fields that will be managed incorrectly for generations. Children die before learning their parents' trades, creating gaps in essential skills that won't be filled for decades. The collapse of civilization, as it turns out, doesn't happen with dramatic battles or the burning of libraries. It happens with the quiet efficiency of rust spreading through the interconnected systems that once held your world together until nothing functions the way it's supposed to. Trade routes that have carried goods for centuries simply stop, not because of war or natural disaster, but because there's nobody left alive or healthy enough to maintain them. The Roman roads, those marvels of engineering that once connected Britain to Byzantium, become pathways for refugees and bandits rather than merchants and messengers. The imperial post system, which used to deliver messages across the empire with clockwork precision, breaks down when too many way stations are abandoned and too many postmasters have died of plague or starvation. Government officials stop arriving to collect taxes, partly because there's nothing left to collect, and partly because the government itself is running on fumes and wishful thinking. Your village, once part of a vast network of trade and communication, becomes an island of isolation. The salt you used to take for granted, brought from coastal regions, you'll never see disappears from local markets. The iron tools that kept your agricultural society functioning can't be repaired when the metal runs out and no new supplies arrive. Even basic commodities, like rope, pottery, and cloth, become precious rarities hoarded by those lucky enough to possess them. Historians still argue whether the collapse was primarily caused by climate disruption, plague, or political instability. But from your perspective, the distinction is academic. What matters is that the systems your ancestors relied on for generations have simply evaporated. The miller's wheel stops turning because there's no grain to mill and no one to repair the mechanism when it breaks. The blacksmith's forge goes cold because there's no fuel to heat it and no iron to work. The roads crack and sprout weeds because there's no one left to maintain them. Local governance becomes increasingly irrelevant as imperial authority fades into something resembling a distant memory. The regional administrator, who used to arrive every few months to settle disputes and collect tribute, hasn't been seen in over a year. Some say he died of plague in the capital. Others claim he simply gave up and returned to his family estate to wait out the crisis. Either way, you're left to govern yourselves, which works about as well as you'd expect when everyone is starving and desperate. The church attempts to fill the vacuum left by secular authority, but even religious institutions struggle to maintain relevance when their promises of divine intervention remain conspicuously unfulfilled. The local priest does his best to provide spiritual comfort, but it's hard to preach about God's love when half his congregation has died horribly and the other half is slowly starving. Some people turn to religion with renewed fervor, viewing their suffering as a test of faith. Others quietly abandon their beliefs, concluding that any God who would permit such misery is either powerless or malicious. Banditry becomes less a criminal enterprise than an alternative form of social organization. Groups of displaced people, often led by former soldiers or minor nobles, establish themselves as local warlords, ruling over tiny territories carved from the ruins of larger political units. They're not necessarily evil, just pragmatic, collecting tribute from travelers and trading protection for provisions. The line between legitimate authority and organized theft becomes increasingly blurred when there's no higher power left to make distinctions. Your world shrinks from a connected empire to a collection of isolated settlements, each struggling to survive independently. News from the outside world becomes unreliable and increasingly rare. You hear conflicting reports about whether the emperor is still alive, whether Constantinople still stands, whether there are still functioning cities anywhere in the known world. For all practical purposes, civilization has retreated beyond your horizon, leaving you in a landscape that would be familiar to your great-great-grandfather who lived before the roads were built. The economic system reverts to something approaching primitive barter, though even that assumes people have surplus goods to trade. Currency becomes meaningless when there's nothing to buy. The elaborate financial instruments that once facilitated long-distance commerce letters of credit banking relationships, standardized weights, and measures disappear along with the merchants who used them. You're back to a subsistence economy where wealth is measured in grain stores and livestock rather than coins or property deeds. Knowledge dies with the people who possessed it. The traveling scholars who once moved between monasteries, preserving and copying ancient texts, can no longer travel safely or find institutions capable of supporting their work. Libraries decay from neglect rather than destruction, their contents slowly moldering in buildings that leak and lack proper care. The oral traditions maintained by village elders vanish when the elders die, and there's no one left with the leisure time necessary to memorize complex stories or genealogies. The end, when it comes, arrives not with drama or revelation, but with the quiet efficiency of a body that has simply run out of excuses to continue. You don't wake up one morning knowing it's your last. That kind of narrative clarity is a luxury reserved for heroes and stories, not for anonymous peasants whose primary achievement is having lasted this long. Instead, you drift through what will become your final days with the same numb persistence that has carried you through the endless months of gray sky and empty stomachs. Your final week passes in a haze of small rituals that no longer serve any practical purpose but somehow still matter. You check the barren fields one last time, though you know nothing will ever grow there again. You mend a hole in your cloak with thread that's more patches than original fabric, even though you're too weak to walk far enough for the repair to matter. You count and recount the last few grains in your store, arranging them in tiny piles as if organization might somehow multiply their number through pure wishful thinking. The hunger has evolved beyond mere physical discomfort into something almost mystical, a constant companion that shapes every thought, every breath, every heartbeat. Your body has begun the process of consuming itself, metabolizing muscle tissue and organ function to keep your brain working just long enough to witness your own slow dissolution. You've become transparent, insubstantial, a ghost haunting the ruins of your own life while waiting for the formality of death to catch up with the reality of your situation. Your family, what remains of it, moves around you with the careful tenderness of people who understand they're participating in a goodbye that nobody wants to acknowledge out loud. Your wife brings you water, even though lifting the cup requires more strength than you possess. Your surviving child sits nearby, not speaking, but simply being present in the way that children do when they sense something important is happening, but lack the vocabulary to describe it. Historians still argue whether the population decline of the 6th century was primarily due to plague famine or climate disruption, but you represent something more fundamental than statistical analysis can capture. You are one of millions who simply faded away during humanity's worst year, leaving behind no monuments, no written records, no DNA samples for future scientists to study. Your death will contribute to the great silence that settles over much of Europe during this period, the absence of voices that once filled villages, marketplaces, and family gatherings. The irony isn't lost on you, even in your weakened state, that you're dying, just as the first hints of change begin to appear in the world around you. The gray sky has started to show occasional patches of something that might charitably be called blue. The temperature has risen slightly enough that frost no longer forms inside your hut every night. Somewhere in the distance, you imagine you can hear birds singing, though that might just be the hallucination of a brain deprived of adequate nutrition for too long. These signs of potential recovery arrive too late for you, but not too late for the world. The volcanic winter that has gripped the planet for months is finally beginning to relax its hold, allowing sunlight to filter through the atmospheric debris with increasing strength. Future generations will eventually rebuild, replant, and repopulate the areas that have been devastated by this cosmic accident. They'll develop new traditions, new forms of government, new ways of organizing society that take into account the lessons learned from watching everything fall apart. But those future generations will know nothing of your specific struggle, your particular moment of quiet surrender in a cold hut while the world slowly remembers how to function. History will record the broad outlines of the crisis, the volcanic winter, the plague, the political collapse. But it won't preserve the individual stories of people like you who faced the end of the world with nothing more than stubborn persistence and the hope that someone somewhere might survive to tell a better story. Your breathing becomes shallower, more irregular, as your body finally acknowledges what your mind has known for weeks. This is the conclusion of your unremarkable life in humanity's most remarkable year for all the wrong reasons. You close your eyes, not in defeat, but in something approaching peace, knowing that you've done everything possible with the impossible circumstances you were given. The last thing you see before the darkness takes you is a thin shaft of genuine sunlight streaming through a crack in your roof, the first real sunshine you've witnessed in nearly a year. It illuminates a small patch of floor where dust motes dance in the warming air, tiny particles caught in golden light that seems to promise, however futilely, that somewhere beyond your immediate experience, the world still remembers how to be beautiful. Outside, the long winter is finally beginning its retreat. The volcanic ash will eventually settle, the crops will eventually grow again, and civilization will eventually rebuild itself from the scattered pieces of what came before. Children will be born who never knew the gray sky, who take sunshine for granted, who live in a world where famine is a distant memory rather than an immediate threat. But you won't see any of that recovery. Your story ends here in this moment of quiet transition between the worst year in human history and whatever comes next. You die as you lived, without fanfare, without recognition, without leaving any trace that historians will bother to record. You are simply another casualty of circumstances beyond your control, another voice silenced by a cosmic event that cared nothing for individual human suffering. And yet, in some small way, your struggle matters. Not because it achieved anything measurable, not because it influenced the course of history, but because it represents the countless untold stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances with whatever dignity they could muster. You survived longer than many, shorter than some, and exactly as long as the universe permitted. The world will go on without you, as worlds do. The sun will shine again, crops will grow, children will laugh, and people will eventually forget that there was ever a year when the sky went dark and everything fell apart. But for this one moment in this one place, your life intersected with history in a way that meant everything to you and nothing to the vast machinery of human civilization. In the gathering quiet of your final breath, there's a strange comfort in knowing that you've witnessed something unprecedented, the worst year in human history, and somehow managed to remain human through all of it. That's not nothing. That's actually quite something, even if no one will ever know to appreciate it. The world settles around your stillness, already moving on to whatever comes next. Somewhere in the distance, the sun shines a little brighter, promising better days for those who will live to see them. Your part in this story is finished, but the story itself continues carrying forward the possibility that even the worst years eventually end, and that somewhere beyond every winter, no matter how long or dark spring still waits patiently for its turn to bloom. Rest now. Your watch is over. The long darkness is finally lifting, and those who remain will build something new from what you helped preserve, simply by refusing to give up until the very end. Sleep well in the knowledge that you did what you could with what you had when the world itself seemed determined to make that impossible. And so we close the book on this quiet catastrophe, this anonymous ending to an unremarkable life in humanity's most terrible year. The volcanic winter will lift the plague, will run its course, and civilization will slowly rebuild itself from the ashes of what came before. New stories will be written, new lives will begin, new hopes will replace the old despairs. But tonight, we remember those who didn't make it to see the sunrise, return the countless forgotten voices who faced the darkness with whatever courage they could find and held on just long enough to pass the light to those who came after. Thank you for walking through this shadow with me, for honoring the memory of people whose names were never recorded, but whose struggles shaped the world we inherited. Sweet dreams, and may your own skies always remember how to shine.